for the deep geothermal, there was one permit in the late 1970s. In fact, it was February 1978, which was the first geothermal geopressured well that was permitted. And so the Railroad Commission has pretty much maintained that authority for permitting the deep geothermal wells, but we haven't really had any activity until most recently, which is February of this year, 2025, where we've had under kind of the new guidelines, the new framework, Sage Geosystems permitted a well.
Welcome to Geothermal Unleashed, where we will explore the cutting edge of geothermal energy. I'm Elizabeth Cambre from the Vallourec New Energies team. I'm here to help educate and document geothermal's rise in the global energy transition. I'm pleased to welcome Jared Ware, the Senior Engineer and Systems Analyst from the Texas Railroad Commission. Jared, thank you for joining me today. And I noticed some exciting announcement about a new geothermal permit in Texas, and we're definitely going to discuss that today. And we're going to discuss the permitting process for geothermal wells here in Texas. But before we get started on that conversation, why don't you introduce yourself and provide a brief overview of your background and your role at the Texas Railroad Commission?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Elizabeth. It's great to be on with you. Love sharing all the things that are happening at the commission and really in the geothermal industry right now. It's an exciting time, particularly on the regulatory side. My background, I've been working on the geothermal energy and associated resources requirements for about 16 months. Prior to that, I was the director of the critical infrastructure division for the agency. And then before that, I worked at Texas Commission on Environmental Quality as a director. I worked at as a federal employee at Army Futures Command as a energy and environmental engineer, running that program for Army Futures Command. And then before that was my first introduction to the Railroad Commission. I was the Geographical Information Systems Manager, which was the well department at the time. And so that's really where I learned a lot about oil, gas, pipelines. And that was prior to all the requirements that we picked up recently, one of them being geothermal energy.
Cool. Okay, so let's jump in. I've got a number of questions for you today, but I want to start by looking at the history first of permitting of geothermal wells. So can you walk us through what the history of permitting has looked like in Texas? And I'm really curious, how many geothermal wells have actually been permitted in Texas to date?
I'm sure, yeah, talk a little bit about the history. I would say that it's been sporadic. And I'd say Texas does have a kind of a storied but somewhat muted history with respect to permitting the geothermal wells. That makes sense because over the past 125 years, everything has been oil, gas, and pipelines. And then I think recently, within the last decade or 15 years, there's been a bigger emphasis on the renewables like solar and wind. And so geothermal has been overshadowed as kind of that reliable and available source of energy. But here's what I would say: that's about to change, particularly with the last legislative session in Texas. And then there's been kind of the slow evolution and slow build of geothermal energy since the late 1970s. And so kind of with that in the history, back in the early 70s, there were several academic research projects conducted. And it was looking at, is Texas a viable location to have geothermal energy, and specifically along the coastal areas and then kind of the northeast area of Texas. And then kind of in the late 80s and early 90s, so for the shallow geothermal wells, which most people would look at as ground source heat pumps or return flow wells, there was a significant spike. That's that sporadic part of it. And there was some federal funding through Habitat for Humanity and some grants to the independent school districts here in Texas, where there was a growth in the larger cities. So there was this, large amount of permitting activity in the Austin area for its schools, in the Dallas area, and also in Houston. And then, some small areas for homes, so private residences. And then for the deep geothermal, there was one permit in the late 1970s. In fact, it was February 1978, which was the first geothermal geopressured well that was permitted. And so the Railroad Commission has pretty much maintained that authority for permitting the deep geothermal wells, but we haven't really had any activity until most recently, which is February of this year, 2025, where we've had under kind of the new guidelines and new framework, Sage Geosystems permitted a well. So again, sporadic, but kind of looking at it from a regulatory perspective, breaking it down as, again, the Railroad Commission has had authority to permit since the 70s for deep geothermal wells under Geothermal Energy and Associated Resources regulations, and Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and its predecessor organizations, changed names a few times, had authority over those shallow geothermal wells. Well, that all changed 2 years ago when the Railroad Commission got authority for all closed loop geothermal injection wells, class 5 wells, under Senate Bill 786. So that's been kind of the quick history. And then to your second question, the number of wells permitted. So looking back over the last 40 years for the shallow wells, it's about 3,300 wells across Texas. And most of those are between 300 and 450 in depth. And again, ground source heat pump, return flow wells. I spent a lot of time once those records came over to the Railroad Commission, taking them from legacy hard copy, digitizing them, putting together in a GIS. And what I learned is a lot about the timelines and patterns about the permitting activity in the state. Most recently, Bedrock Geothermal Company permitted, that was the first one I worked on at the Railroad Commission. And so what's changed really are the locations, the uses, and the depth. Those are 700 to 800 foot wells here in Austin. So we're seeing that shift in paradigm of depths based off of technology and innovations. And so I think it's kind of interesting over the history. I would say that kind of the history is now in the current as we're starting to see a lot more activity here in the kind of across Texas. And you kind of seen, if you were to kind of look at our public GIS viewer, which has all of our well activity, you wouldn't see a geothermal well in the past because the one and that Pleasant Bayou, the first well, has been plugged. So you just see the plugging icon. But what you'll see now is that Sage Geosystems project with San Miguel Electric Cooperative. You'll see an icon on our public viewer that shows it in the geothermal. So we're pretty excited about this at the agency because we're able to kind of take this program, transform it from kind of this legacy way of permitting and really start building a framework out that's going to put us, well into the future of how we do regulation for geothermal energy and associated resources in Texas.
Interesting. Okay, so there's now two previously or permitted geothermal wells in Texas. And so I'm really curious to understand the framework. And so how has the framework evolved? And I'm assuming all of the evolution is happening right now, since we haven't had, and I'm talking specifically for the deep geothermal, we haven't had a permit since 1976, you said?
1978. So
78, okay.
Yeah, the regulatory framework is pretty much been static since probably the early 80s until 2023. And so the Railroad Commission has maintained jurisdiction over oil, gas, geothermal energy, and associated resources. So it has been possible to permit, so all that time with the Railroad Commission using our existing rules that are on the books. And so we're able to do that because really deep well drilling and the requirements are covered under the Underground Injection Control Program, which was established by Environmental Protection Agency. So that has always been available to anyone that wanted to permit a geothermal well. And TCEQ had the requirements for those class 5 ground source heat pump wells. And that changed 2 years ago in that Senate Bill 786, where it defined closed loop geothermal injection well and then assigned full jurisdiction to the Railroad Commission. So now all permitting of closed loop systems are with the Railroad Commission. So it was pretty much, again, a static process, and then everything moved to us. Kind of some of the things that we learned engaging is really kind of engaging with our stakeholders and then following that legislative process. And I'd say our government relations does a great job with this. And so we were having to look at a new framework based off of the new requirements set in that statute. And so kind of during this session, the Texas is in session now, we're looking at that. So our staff kind of conducts reviews of any proposed legislation, and then we do a baseline analysis and look at the impacts and implications. And so that changed, that moved us from kind of that static process of permitting with our existing rules Now we have a requirement to develop a deep geothermal well from last session, which we expect to be completed late summer, early fall, and approved by our commissioners. So that deep geothermal will be in place. We had the shallow geothermal well approved in December, implemented in January. So all that's really just changed for the industry in the last 2 months, and now we're moving into to March. But we're still seeing those implication impacts integrated into the requirements in the previous session. And then we're also continuing to engage with stakeholders and associations, because now we're going to have kind of an overlap of information, recent permitting through Sage and some of the other companies that are looking at permits. So we're looking to integrate all of those requirements into the deep geothermal rule and have that in place. So whatever new comes from this legislative session, we'll have everything kind of put together. So it's been an interesting process putting these multifunctional project teams together, build and create the functions to support that regulatory process. But again, it's really been more like the last 18 months where all things geothermal has really kicked in Texas.
Okay, so you mentioned closed loop, and we've also mentioned the shallow. So are these the two different buckets of permitting? And can you define what you mean by closed loop geothermal?
Yeah, Elizabeth, what we're looking at from the definition was closed loop. So a system in terms of closed loop, it being encased, simplicity, all encased in a pipe, or all encased in the same formation. So it has no touching with any other formation if it's within kind of a closed loop deep formation. So there's kind of two flavors of the deep geothermal. And then whether you looked at it, the enhanced geothermal systems or the advanced geothermal systems, or some of these new hybrids that are kind of geopressure geothermal cycling systems, that falls into the category of kind of the deep closed loop. On the shallow side, it's the ground source heat pump. The only difference that we have with that portion of the regulation on the shallow side is if it's an open system, like it's a pond or kind of shallow sort of water source where that ground source heat pump is gathering the water, that's going to be Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. The Railroad Commission has never dealt with those shallow heat pumps. That's always been a purview of TCEQ because of the requirements they have for regulating water. We regulate energy, so we wanted to keep those cultures the same. So, and what ended up happening in the definition is because it's legally closed loop, however that's defined in industry, in the law, and we looked at other states, we have jurisdiction over any system that's defined as closed loop under the Class 5 UIC program at EPA.
Got it. Okay, interesting. Okay, so it's my understanding too that there are only permits for injection wells. Is that correct?
So it's defined as an injection well. So a geothermal well, because of that definition that came out of Senate Bill 786 in last session, defined really within that geothermal energy and associated resources category that we've pretty much always regulated at the Railroad Commission. That Class 5 category as defined by EPA, it kind of got that closed loop label added to it. So legally anything that has that closed loop geothermal injection well moniker is something that we permit. However, going back to that earlier example from February 1978, it was still permitted as on the W1 form. It states Wildcat is kind of a category, but it's interesting because the information on the form itself, assigned an API number, was geothermal geopressure, which we're seeing what's kind of old is now new. Well, it's not really new. We're actually looking at that for that. So Sage had looked at kind of a hybrid system that they've developed, which is not what we would traditionally look at as a closed loop geothermal injection well by EGS or AGS standards or earlier standards, but it is a geothermal injection well by Class 5 EPA. So it falls within that category. So we have a broad array of designs. And what we didn't want to do at the Railroad Commission was kind of break it down into static designs and do that because the industry and the technology changes. I would say our agency is very good at looking at perforations into the geological surface of the earth and then being able to regulate that. So oil, gas, or any other sources that we look at for minerals. Geothermal is no different in that aspect, and it's really no different with respect to the requirements under the Clean Water Act or any of the federal regulations. So again, we've had that jurisdiction for a while because our agency is we have several experts looking at those particular areas. So geothermal was just kind of a natural fit for us in terms of regulation.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, I hear just from, my interaction in the geothermal space that there are many startup companies that are looking at um, projects in Texas. So I'm surprised that there are not more, maybe there are. Are there more projects that are in the process of permitting and we've only just heard that Sage has been permitted? But I'm just curious what trends you're seeing. Are you talking to some of these startup companies? And what are we going to see in the geothermal permitting space in the next year? What is it going to look like?
I would say it's growing. I would say that trend is definitely increasing. And looking at, there's always usually a first. So I would say, from in terms of breaking the ice, it was Sage. They had a pretty extensive and I would say engineering complex geothermal infrastructure that they were putting in place, not just the actual drilling of the well. So from that aspect, I think that they proved probably one of the harder cases of being able to permit, a geothermal project here in Texas. And they did a great job with it. They engaged with us, worked with our staff, any questions that came up. But they had to also get several other permits because they had to permit for the electricity with Public Utility Commission. So they really took on a complex engineering project. And as a person who used to manage and complex engineering projects in the military, I would say my hat's off to Sage. They really were great asking questions, staying engaged with the staff, and then if they ran up against any concerns, we could work through that on a regulatory process. And I would say they did that with Public Utility Commission and all their other permitting. So the first real kind of jump into the deep geothermal wells were on the military installations. So Sage is the company, Fervo and Ever here in Texas. So those were the first three, I'd say established geothermal companies. But I've had conversations with four other companies that are definitely setting up projects, getting funding here in Texas, and they're asking all those questions. And so, again, this time last year, I was talking to Cindy Taff and her staff at Sage, and then there's another company that I would say that operates in the shallow, which is Bedrock, with Silvio Levescu and his group on permitting the shallow geothermal, which are deeper than what we expected based off of those historic trends. So working that project with Bedrock, that's permitted here in Austin at the Penfield, which is kind of looks like the old Air Force Base Logistics Center, but they have a industrial site where different companies go in and, kind of startups. And they built that out, 35,000 square foot facility, and it's all geothermal, 10 wells at 700, 800 feet. So that changed the paradigm for the shallow, and they worked that permit through us. And again, another great company and a great staff. And then Cindy concurrently was working the deep geothermal. So, for me, learning this early on, and the job was great because I've now seen, I would consider two of the more complex projects permitted in Texas. And what we saw was educating our staff and growing our staff to understand that has been a more seamless process than I anticipated. It's been a lot of good conversations with companies that want to do business here, a couple of email conversations with other states like Colorado who have recently permitted, and then getting some feedback from a couple of other states. So I would say our regulatory environment is straightforward because we do so many things at the agency for permits, but we also have an established process and established staff. So we really just kind of augmented what we were already doing, and that augmentation being bringing in geothermal, because we just recently did this with carbon capture and sequestration. Although we don't regulate the capture part, sequestration and transportation and storage is under us. And we just recently worked that for those Class 6 wells. So again, it's been some learning along the way for us as an agency, but it's also been open to engaging with trade associations like TexGea or at Geothermal Rising, talking to the different companies that are there and the researchers at Bureau of Economic Geology or any of the other states' academic research, like Louisiana has a pretty good setup, Oklahoma, Colorado. So we're learning from others, and we're also kind of restructuring what we do in our framework so we can accommodate these companies, how they operate, and make it easy for them to understand how regulatory business is done in Texas.
Interesting. So how complex is it to get a geothermal permit in Texas? And if you were to compare the process in Texas, I know you've mentioned other states like Colorado and Louisiana, how like the pace, does Texas move fairly quickly with the permitting process? And how does that fare against the other states?
Yeah, that's another good question, Elizabeth, because I've seen some of the, on LinkedIn, and I kind of keep up with what's going on with different folks in the industry, and it kind of talked about the permitting. And so that's kind of a loaded question because I can say there's the Railroad Commission of Texas permitting process. There's a Public Utility Commission process for being able to connect to the electric grid. There's probably a Texas Commission on Environmental Quality process if water or those things that they regulate are associated with it. There's groundwater conservation districts in Texas that have a regulatory requirement. And then there's the local. So when you add all that up, I would say if you have a good plan, you have secured your lease, and you understand the kind of the permitting requirements and the forms, it goes fairly quickly. I would say the Sage project, what took the longest part of that was just kind of understanding how putting all those different components together and sequencing that through the regulatory would take. And normally, I think they did that in really under a year, I would say, because I think they started in like March or April, and they were already permitted with us. Normally, to get a permit just to get on the electric grid, at best is 18 months. That's at best. Normally, it's 2 years. So I would say kudos to doing their homework. For our process for permitting, we have to have it done at like starting from scratch to issuing that permit. Our process is 45 days at most. I would say we could do that process now that we've got our team stood up of 6 folks under Philip Warren in the special injection program. And we have an established technical permitting directorate that already does UIC. And we have support from we call it's our program support staff in the oil and gas division, which is Leslie Savage, chief geologist, Ted Wooten, chief engineer, and me as kind of the senior scientist, give full support to that process. And so I would say definitely within 45 days from the time that we receive all of the permits. Now, again, go to our website. It's one page under our geothermal page is one page, and it really gives you a list of the forms that need to be filled out. Companies that have kind of worked with oil and gas in the past will be extremely familiar with those forms. And for them, it's just, kind of business as usual. For a company that comes from another state, maybe Colorado or Nevada or Utah or North Carolina, and they're like, wow, what is a W1? What is a GW2? What is an organization report? What's a P5? That's going to take some education and working with our staff to learn how to fill out those forms. So normally we do those updates once a year at our regulatory conference, which this year is early July. So we'll sit down, walk you through what's changed. And so for people new to the oil and gas industry or pipelines or in this case, geothermal or carbon capture or critical infrastructure, we do that once a year to walk people through that process, and they meet with everyone in that permitting. We haven't done that for geothermal yet. So I would say we'll definitely do that in this year's conference, and we'll have that kind of training and education infrastructure set up that we haven't had except for training our own staff.
That's fabulous. Well, I would be interested in attending that. So I'm curious, are there other initiatives? I think that is one initiative that does support the development of geothermal energy in the state. Are there other initiatives that the Railroad Commission participate in to support more geothermal projects in Texas?
Yeah, so we show up to different conferences where we met last year, and then any of the academic seminars like at Southwest Research Institute, and then for any of the more operational outreach like you hosted in
Yeah.
Navasota. So we're again learning the industry ourselves because again it was kind of this sporadic permitting, and then all of a sudden the legislature gives this to us as an agency, and so. Um, Full support from our commissioners, full support really from the legislature to go out and figure it out and get the regulation in place. One thing that we do about every 2 months is Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance, one of the trade associations, reached out to us and asked us if we could host a kind of a webinar every couple of months just to engage with the community. And so we've been doing that for about the past year and 2 3 months, and we're setting up another one. We're working on that right now with Jay Gillespie, who's the new executive director there. But I've been working with Matt Welch and Ben Seabury and Barry Smitherman over the past year. And I think Barry, having been a previous railroad commissioner, understood how important it was to kind of build those linkages with the regulatory side because that tends to be, I don't know, most people kind of look at regulatory and it doesn't have the most positive of connotations. And we want to change that. We have a great opportunity with geothermal because for us, just receiving full jurisdiction, it's fairly new to us as an agency for permitting. And we're already building those relationships with the regulated community, with our stakeholders, and honestly with the other agencies like TCQ, TDLR for the water wells, and then our groundwater conservation districts. So we're invited to speak at conferences. Leslie Savage and I recently presented at the groundwater districts annual conference, and so their trade association asked us, Adam Foster, hey, could you provide an update? So that's been a big change for the shallow community because that was really kind of TCQ, TDLR, and all of a sudden you got to deal with the Railroad Commission. So we wanted to build those relationships. I've been out to project sites. So there was a shallow geothermal well in kind of northeast Texas that I went to in Upshur County, where they're redoing the entire county courthouse. But they're putting geothermal in. I was up there when they were drilling the well and putting in the closed loop systems, and so and there were the well driller companies there, the engineering company was there, the county judge was there, and so they're really interested. The county judge was extremely excited about this project. So there's funding through the really Department of Energy grants that they were able to get through the Texas Historical Commission to do these projects for these historical locations in Texas. And so they thought geothermal is the way to go. So that was a interesting project to see how everything was happening in the ground, in the engineering of the facility itself. And then Sylvia Levescu invited Sean Abbott, who's our assistant director in technical permitting, and myself to the site kind of late spring here in Austin and showed us what was going on. So we're learning that the innovations, the technology, and really the changes and how we would traditionally look at a well site. Pretty easy. You go out into the Permian Basin or Eagle Ford Shale, and you look for a Christmas tree and you call it good. Well, it's a little bit different geothermal because most of the infrastructure it's under the ground and then it's going into some facility, or the facility itself is running the geothermal. That's a little bit of change for us in terms of how we would inspect and what we would look for from a regulatory. So that learning process, we have to be out at the seminars, the conferences, being engaged with all the stakeholders in government, in business, and academia.
Interesting. So what do you see? Everyone is talking about the launch and a big increase in the geothermal industry in the coming years. What do you see as the future? What buzz are you hearing, particularly in Texas?
Yeah, the trend I hear from everyone in every conference is, Texas is open for business. I hear that, and we're open for business in a lot of things. And so I think one thing that helps us is we do have a great business environment in Texas. We look at all facets of regulation as it impacts any sort of industry or activity, and we have an environment that really focuses on helping those businesses thrive. And I would say the growth is going to continue. And I think one of the trends that kind of surprised me a little bit early on with geothermal was really the leaders in geothermal was the federal government and specifically the Department of Defense. So the projects that are happening on the military installations here in Texas, we like to call ourselves like, military USA. I actually heard, I was watching the Energy Resources yesterday, the committee here in Texas, because our commissioner, Craddock, was talking for the agency. But some of the questions that came up were about energy resources in general. And one of the committee members, she had asked, are you engaging with military installations and then some of the opportunities there? And like, she gets it, because one of the big kind of discussions right now in the Association of Defense Communities, which is a trade association for military installations, is energy resilience in these sites. And so Joint Base San Antonio has a project, geothermal project, that they're working through the Air Force side of things. We have the Ellington Air Force Base project in Houston, and we have the Fort Bliss project, White Sands, out in West Texas. So those three kind of key hotspots for geothermal energy, as from a geologic standpoint, are being covered in those three projects on military installations. The ability to have that kind of deep geothermal, dispatchable 24/7, safe, secure, reliable, and resilient energy source is very appealing to the military and Department of Defense, and then being able to maintain that. And I thought I actually went and spoke at the Association of Defense Community kind of annual conference in San Antonio a few months ago. I have a background in geospatial information science, so it was more from doing the analysis and working with military installations. But I was also in the military for 25 years as a Army engineer officer. So I'd worked those projects, and in 2 years at Futures Command as the environmental and energy engineer. So I know that's a big topic for military. And what better place for military installations to do this than Texas, because we have a lot of them. And I think from a federal standpoint, it's becoming a lot easier from a regulatory side to permit. And I think Texas, particularly the Railroad Commission, we've been at the forefront of changing that regulation and showing how you can do this smartly and streamline advice, all of the onerous requirements from NEPA, and then having to go through 14 other agencies. We kind of already do that and have experts on staff. A lot of people don't know that. We can do a lot of these things a lot faster if we could just kind of streamline some of these regulatory areas and make it smoother and address the gaps, which may not exist in some of the federal projects, but may exist working in Texas. And we focus on how we can make things move faster, and then we also try to bridge any gaps that occur just to make the regulatory environment much easier.
Okay, so for my own clarity, so permitting on Air Force bases, that would go through the Texas Railroad Commission.
Yes, it would. That's a great question, Elizabeth, because that's come up a few times. So just because it's on federal land doesn't mean that you can't get a permit. Kind of example on the because it's in law. So
Yeah.
just like the Class 6, so for the carbon dioxide wells, we have a law and a rule in place. So it's our Chapter 5 rule for Class 6 wells. I thought that's interesting. They made it first, so they got the chapter before we did with Class 5, and and Class 6 chapter for geothermal. But be that as it may, we still have those in the statute. So even though we don't have primacy for permitting CO2 wells currently, we're working on that. We were required under Texas law to seek primacy from Environmental Protection Agency to permit the CO2 wells, and we did. So we have a law in place. So even though the permit has to go through EPA for approval at the federal level, there is still a requirement in Texas that you have to get a permit with the Railroad Commission of Texas. That is the exact same requirement for geothermal wells. So just because it's on a federal installation that happens to be in Texas, those companies still have to permit with the Railroad Commission of Texas, okay. or we won't allow you to operate. We would immediately come out find out about it, impose a kind of corrective action, which would be compliance activity. And then once you permit, we would allow you to operate. So warning to those out there that may be on the federal installations or doing those projects, you still got to work with the Railroad Commission of Texas.
Yeah. So I mean, I keep hearing rumblings of the geothermal projects, Ellington Air Force Base. I live down near Webster, so that one is, I'm trying to follow. But so no permits have actually, that process hasn't started for any of these Air Force installations. Are they still in the feasibility phase?
Yeah, I think what I look at it is depending on how the different facets of Department of Defense. I think for the two Air Force and the Army are under different services, but it would be kind of the project delivery stage. So they would say like a phase one or a phase two. So what I see early on is kind of that feasibility or preliminary analysis, and then go into feasibility. And when that project moves to that 65% complete phase for the infrastructure itself, then there's the permit for drilling a well. But it's always good to start early with us, and then we can kind of put those things in place. And then you don't have to kind of wait till that particular phase occurs in the project. However, that's been deemed. And again, these started before we received jurisdiction. The planning started before the Railroad Commission received jurisdiction for those, for all things closed loop geothermal. And so that is a little bit of a shift as well in the regulatory structure. So now kind of working with us, we can kind of get everybody what they need in terms of the permit. And we do this for other requirements on federal installations as well. We work with, oil and gas at the federal level, and those entities that happen to operate in Texas, even though they may be a federal agency, they still have to permit through the Railroad Commission to operate here in Texas. And that's, LNG or large oil storage. So those permits, we maintain those permits, we inspect those locations. And in fact, with critical infrastructure, when I was the director of that division, there was some critical infrastructure that was at the federal level that we actually inspected because it was part of the, electricity supply chain. So those things are still permitted and regulated by the Railroad Commission of Texas.
Okay. So, you mentioned you have a webinar where you educate the public. You're going to do an event. You'll have to remind me on the name of it this summer, where you invite folks to come and learn about the process. Do you do any other publications like a newsletter to help everyone kind of keep abreast and follow what's happening in this space?
We do. So we have an Energy Minute, which is through our communications division, and in some cases through our government affairs division. So we'll have regulatory updates, kind of energy updates, or kind of procedural updates with the agency, and those are available once a month. We have an internal newsletter. We do publish it, externally, and it's more along the lines of what's going on in the Railroad Commission. But usually about every 2 or 3 months, I'll publish something related to geothermal. So it's just kind of a quick update of what's going on. And then the information on our kind of homepage, if anything comes up, like we publish information about the first permit that Sage had. We'll probably continue to publish updates. Our executive director, Wei Wang, conducted kind of a quick interview and talked about that. So if you've seen any of the kind of recent print publications or online, you'll see his comments on, really this first well that we've done, in the last 40 years. So it's a pretty big deal for the agency. I would say it's great work from our staff. And again, I'm not technically in the permitting process. That's really Philip Warren and technical permitting and the SIP team. But from kind of a make sure the regulatory processes are working and that we don't have any gaps from start to finish, I've seen that work, whether it's all the other forms that we have to fill out that may not be part of the technical permitting, but it's in administrative compliance with Joe Sestili's team, or even from field operations with David Lindley and his group. We work through those things early on so we wouldn't have any gaps in our systems. And then working with our IT division with Ray Young, we've worked all those things out over time. So the things you kind of don't see happening behind the scenes, nor would it be probably it's just anybody is, we're working feverishly to make sure that the permitting process works seamlessly. And then we're able to store this information, share the information, and meet our regulatory requirements for storing of information, sharing of information. And so those things are happening on a daily basis. So we put a lot of effort into the permitting because obviously that's the most important part for companies. And then after that, what we end up having is more, I guess, kind of a seamless process, less questions unless there's something that comes up that may be kind of new to everybody, and we can work that out as a staff. But I would say normally what happens is once it's permitted, we don't hear from you again until your permit needs to be updated or you got to provide some information to us. And that's usually just a standard process. It's all kind of in that early permitting stages is honestly the hardest part because that's the regulatory structure and how things are set up. So that's where we put most of our emphasis in the overall process. Everything follow on is pretty straightforward.
Wonderful. Well, Jared, this was a fabulous conversation, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And I also want to thank our listeners for joining us on this episode of Geothermal Unleashed. I hope today's discussion has sparked new insights and deepened everyone's understanding of the geothermal industry's incredible potential. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and let's continue working together to unleash the full potential of geothermal. Thank you, and thank you, Jared.